Well, hello and welcome back to Read Becca for my weekly chatty catch up on everything that I've read, everything I'm currently reading, and everything I'm looking forward to reading for roughly the current week, as well as some general life chit chat. So let's catch up on the books. The first thing I finished was 2 volumes of manga, the Delicious in Dungeon series Volume 2 and Volume 3. This is a really lovely black and white manga written and illustrated by Ryoko and translated by Engel. And I have enjoyed this so much. I read the first volume a while ago, several years ago, and liked it so much and wanted to continue on and just really didn't. And then I spotted volumes 2 through I think 6 at Half Price Books. Got very lucky. They were super on sale and in perfect condition. And so I snatched them up and then I never read them. So I'm very happy to be getting these read from my shelves. Like I said, I have a couple more volumes to get to. And the series has now also come out on Netflix, so that's available. So I'm wanting to go watch the series and see how that translates from this text. What I like about this so much is this is the story of adventurers in a pretty standard world with dungeons where they go on quests and kill monsters. They're adventurers dungeon diving for fortune and to keep themselves going, right? But in this world, when one of them dies, they have the ability to resurrect this person, but they don't have supplies. So they rush out, they go to get supplies, and they're thinking if they need to keep stocking up, it will take them forever. And so they decide to try and rush back by not stocking up as much on supplies and just using what they can forage in the dungeon. And so that is the big premise for this series, is this group of adventurers have decided they're going to forage and cook monsters and dungeon vegetables, basically, whatever they can find. And so it's kind of a cooking manga, but it's also very much a fantasy, questy, dungeon delving manga. And I have enjoyed this so much because that keeps it very, very low stakes, and the fact that they're in a dungeon where people can be resurrected and death is not really on the line is great, though they do get into scuffles and under threat, certainly, because they're constantly in conflict with monsters. What has not worked for me as well, or what keeps this from being a 5-star read for me, like these have all I think been 4-star reads, volume 1 through 3, is that they're very episodic. So I don't feel like we're seeing a huge plot arc play out or getting too overly attached to the characters as much as I would like, but we are getting some really great world building as we've gone along, and that is the big strength of world building for sure. So in these 2 volumes, again, we have mainly episodic stories with each of these binding up about, I think, 3 or 4 stories, and then some small, like, asides about monsters. In those stories, they're going through one encounter and then cooking, basically. And as that goes along, that's always fun, but the world building that we're seeing grow through this is mainly about the symbiotic relationship that adventurers have with the dungeon in this world, and them realizing more and more how important that is. So it almost has a very environmental message without coming on heavy with that. I think that that's done well. I don't like heavy-handed messaging in my books. So this feels natural. It feels like we're just hearing about the world building of this world and how dungeon creation might work, how the monsters may work, but it's very naturally telling us something about the symbiosis between man and nature. So I have enjoyed this very much. I will try and make sure to insert some art here so you can see what it looks like, but I am definitely continuing on and planning to enjoy the show. I have not yet looked to see how many volumes the series is covering, so I need to check that, and once I am caught up to that point, I will actually start watching the series on Netflix. But this has been just a great time. Then I read something much more heavy. I read The Three Mothers, How the Mothers of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and James Baldwin Shaped a Nation. And this is by Malaika. It was on my radar because I had watched an author interview event over lockdown. There were a ton of those streamed online through my library, and I really enjoyed it, but I never actually read the book. So I'm glad I finally did get to it. And I actually listened to it in audio for my nonfiction audiobooking project from the library, and I enjoyed this so much, completely lived up to my expectations, and the author does narrate it, and she is a fantastic narrator. She used her doctoral research, I think it was doctoral, it was a thesis research, basically. She adapted it into this book, and I can kind of see that, the presence of that being where it came from, but this was so much more. I think that this gave such a broad and very encompassing history of the treatment of Black women through slavery and freedom, through the repression of their reproductive rights, and as they have clawed their way toward that, the way that we perceive Black women and mothers, and the way that history has erased them. And I think one of the things I didn't expect about this is that, looking at the subtitle, it sounds like this is going to be pure biography. And it has very strong biography elements, especially in the back half. The second half is much more biography. But the first half is almost entirely establishing history and using signposted elements of the women's lives to tell us the story of Black women at a broader, expansive level. And so things like one of these women being originally from Grenada is used to talk about colonialism in the Caribbean and how that would have affected her life more directly. But it's using just that sort of bullet point element of her to tell the bigger story. And I think that's both a strength and a weakness of this. For me, this was a very, very good book, so don't take this as really a negative. But the imbalance there between it being almost entirely history in the first half and almost entirely biography in the second half, I feel like that could have been more balanced throughout to have a duality a little bit more aligned across the book. But that just would have taken it from a very, very good book to an exceptional book. And that's really splitting hairs, I think, for me. What I loved about this is that coming at this, I had some background on these topics, and there were so many things that built on stuff that I've read before. So things like Wake, the history of women-led slave revolts, talks very much about the topic of how women's history, and Black women specifically, have been erased from history, or simply people did not care to record the records about their lives, the fact that they were present, and just how much history has been lost because of that is of a significant magnitude. And the author here also talks about the difficulties of trying to research this topic when these people just didn't care to keep dedicated records or thorough records of these women's lives, of even when they were born or died, and the way that history has treated them. So we have that sort of framing, and she takes care to express how difficult it is when the historical record has been altered or has not been upkept. And then we also had some really significant elements that I could see from Half American that I read for the BookTube Prize last year, where Malaika talks through the mistreatment in America of Black soldiers and Black women nurses who were trying to join into the war effort, both in World War I and World War II, and the mistreatment of them. The fact that they didn't get their due as a result of their service. And so she engages with the topics that were covered in Half American, as well as some additional topics that I hadn't seen before. As well, we talk about the ways that systemic injustice in the US has created so many issues with building stability for a family specifically. And I have read White Too Long by Robert P. Jones, and there we had heard, or I had learned about the topic of Black treatment within housing, and specifically religious leaders' influence over communities that kind of incited that or propagated that through their community. And here that connects back because we are hearing about the ways that affected their lives personally in not being able to get housing or getting housing and then immediately having it fall through because they were found out to be Black and the community not allowing them to get housing there because of their race. And so there are so many layers to this that I found connected back and really added substantively to things I have read in this topic before. So it just was a really great broad education. Some topics this covered that were kind of new to me, or not necessarily new, but really built on here that in areas I didn't know about, were the ideas of race suicide, which Roosevelt as a president talked about how a woman who doesn't have children, a white woman specifically, who doesn't have children, is the same as a soldier who runs off the battlefield and flees, a deserter, because they were so entrenched in this idea that the white educated were not reproducing, and that was going to cause a race suicide of white Americans, which is horrifying and echoes extremely true to sentiments that are happening today. And that's why it's so important to know your history and talk about it, because we are repeating it in very many areas, and that's horrifying. Another big one that I had not thought about before reading this at all, I knew of the concepts here that during slavery, of course, women's reproduction was somewhat weaponized for profit by the slave owners. And so for white people benefiting from that financially, they were keeping these women pregnant continuously and pushing that on these women so much. And yet there was such a family importance to these women, though they often had their families divided and separated. They would spend their whole lives trying to keep those connections together. And then as soon as abolition happened and that profit was no longer available to white slave owners, things flipped on their head completely. And the rapidity of that switch is what shocked me. I didn't realize it had happened so quickly, but what occurred was very widespread gynecological research on Black women to horrific levels, involuntary sterilization and birth control against Black women. And that happened in a very fast and jarring way. And obviously both of those things are equally horrific things that we should in no way support and we should have a memory of, but it's so often swept under the rug that all of that was happening. And again, those are things I was aware of, but I hadn't thought about the dissonance between the drive of white power over Black women's bodies in two completely opposite ways. And then in modern times, that has continued on for pregnant women, in that Black women are so much more likely to die from lack of care during childbirth because they're denied care, they're overlooked, they're not treated with the same level of care very, very frequently. And we have seen that in increasing high status cases that are finally starting to get some attention. And so this book just did such a wonderful job of tackling the situation for Black women, the difficulties they had to overcome in society, and the ways that they were looked down on for how they loved their families and the way they tried to hold them together. There's so many different systemic injustices that were facing them, both individually and racially. And I just found this so compelling, both the presentation of the history and the presentation of the women's lives. I haven't really talked about the women's lives or how this discusses their influence on their sons, but I think you should go read it so you can find that out yourself, really. So I think that's it for Three Mothers. Really, it's fantastic nonfiction. I highly, highly recommend you check it out, and very specifically, the audiobook is really great. That, I think, is it for what I finished this week. What I have ongoing right now is some heavy classics. The Master and Margarita is still going. I made great progress on it this week, so I'm well past where I had been, and I was hoping to finish it this week, and I didn't. I had a big slowdown. Another few days, and I hope to be finished with that one. And then I started The Woman in White by WIlkie Collins, that I'm buddy reading with Dia from Novel Idea, and made some great progress on this one as well. So very good classics reading this week. I'm going to need something light, and I don't know what that is. I'm not sure if I want to start my middle grade book or something on ebook, but I did also start a new audiobook, just barely started Poverty by America by Matthew Desmond. A big popular, buzzy book. It's surprisingly quite short, so I think I will be able to get through that quickly and enjoy it. It is also in for the BookTube prize. However, I'm not yet judging the BookTube prize, so I can talk about it currently. But the start of it is very compelling. So I think that's it for the bookish stuff. As far as life, very little to talk about. I went to a festival yesterday, so my day was kind of gone entirely, and it was a fun time though. It was a stout brewery festival, and it's one of those where you pay a flat fee and then you get the cup and you can take it all around. So there were, I think, 25 breweries there. And my favorite was BKS Brewery from Kansas City, or my favorite single stout was from them. And it was like a Thai vanilla and coffee stout. Really, really good. It was one that was not sickly sweet, which some of them were. I do like a sweet stout or a sweet leaning stout, but this one was very subtle, and I liked that a lot. Weather was great, music was great. I had some food as well while we were there. It was really, yeah, it was nice, but it kind of knocked out my day between travel there and back and recovering from a day of drinking stouts. And then as far as watching stuff, I did watch I finished one thing. So I had started The Patient when it came out a while back and just never finished it. It's a very heavy show, so I tend to kind of peter out on heavy shows sometimes, unless I binge them all in one go. So I was glad I went back to this one though. It was so fantastic. This is one of those really, like, it's a single location for the most part, very small cast. I love that. I love those where they're very performance driven kind of shows or movies. And it's mainly just Steve Carell and Donald Gleason in a room together talking. That's most of it. But it is kind of a thriller show. And I don't really want to give anything away other than that, like, The Patient is the title. So obviously one of them is a therapist and the other is his patient. And it's so gripping to watch, and their performances are both just so good. Like, Donald Gleason gets underestimated sometimes, but his acting chops are stellar. Like, clearly his dad really influenced him, I think. He's Donald Gleason. Brendan Gleason is his dad. They both together are so phenomenal actors. Yeah. Donald Gleason always surprises me. So that was a very, very good watch this week. I think that is it for my week this week. I am hopeful for a quiet and mellow week, and next week is mid-month book bash. So I don't currently have anything planned, I don't think. We will see what hits me next week. I don't know. So that's it for me today. Thank you all so very much for watching.